You are listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that's always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here are your hosts, Mark Dailey and Kevin Laramee.
Hello and welcome to episode number 13 of Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One racing. I'm your host, Mark Dailey, and as always, I'm joined by Kevin Laramee. Kevin, what a weekend of sport around the world. We have Tour de France, we have the European Championship final, we have Wimbledon, we have the British Grand Prix, we have so many different things to keep up with. I really don't know where all my time went over the last weekend going between all these different great events, but it was a fantastic weekend of sports.
Bad day for Canada on Sunday. Well, not for Canada, sorry, for me, because, Milos lost to Andy Murray, and Canada didn't qualify for the Rio Olympics in basketball, and France lost in the European final. So I had better days than Sunday, but at least in the British Grand Prix, we saw a great Grand Prix, first of all, and Lewis Hamilton with the hat trick at Silverstone. 3 years on the bounce, 3 wins in a row.
Of just a fantastic and dominating performance by Lewis all weekend long. Nico Rosberg, his teammate, had some problems in free practice. And I don't know, it just had that feeling going into Silverstone and just considering some of the adversity, some of the problems that Lewis had. I just had that gut feeling that this was going to be his weekend, that he was going to come out flying, and he did exactly that. He broke his own lap record during qualifying, and he absolutely smashed it, set a new one. He had his time deleted for exceeding the track limits. That didn't bother him a bit. He went back out and set a faster time. And then
just to go back on that for a second, he went back for a second time. Like the first lap, though, he had fuel for 2 laps. That's the crazy things with the crazy lap that he did. And he was 1.5 seconds faster than the Red Bulls and all the other cars, and 7/100th of a second faster than, 7/10th of a second faster than Nico, which is crazy to have the same car. So, wow.
Yeah, absolutely. When I saw that time go up, I sat up in my chair and I had to almost rub my eyes and take a second look again just to confirm that the time that I was seeing on the screen was in fact reality, because it was really that good. And it was an interesting start to the Grand Prix on Sunday. There was rain before the start and it was really quite gloomy, and they got underway behind the safety car and they went for about 5 or 6 laps. And afterwards, some of the drivers were complaining that the safety car had stayed out a little bit too long, but I think it was a smart idea to get the race started with the safety car, because there was so much standing water, especially into turn 1.
Exactly.
And we saw guys going off all day. We'll talk about that as we break down the Grand Prix over the next little while here, but it was an interesting start, and some guys immediately went into the pit lane to change onto the intermediates, and that was quite an interesting and somewhat hair-raising episode. I thought that there were going to be multiple teams getting stop-go and timing penalties for the unsafe releases, because there seemed to be many near misses.
There was 9 cars at pit row at the same time that went. So you saw the 2 Mercedes and Verstappen continue, and basically everybody else after that just walked in, went into the pit lane, and it was a very hairy situation. We saw Ricciardo getting close to hitting Jordan, getting close to hitting it was so close. I said Jordan. I got no. That's the orange of the car. Well, the yellow orange of the car that got me confused for a second. But if you're looking at that crazy lap, and first of all, the way it started, Mark, you mentioned the rain. It was crazy. It was nice, not even raining. And then it just opened, just drenched exactly when it was supposed to start. So they had the safety car for 5 laps. Then, like you mentioned, they all went into the pit. But what's interesting to me is the cars that decided to go on intermediate did not have early success. It was the wet that were the right choices, because you mentioned turn 1. Not just turn 1, but there was some standing water, and the race line was getting drier and drier. But you just put 1 millimeter of tire outside of that race line, and you saw cars skidding around like it was icy. So no, because of that, I think it was a smarter idea. Like the Lewis, Nico, and Max just stayed on wet.
Yeah, I think those couple extra laps that they waited made all the difference because, as you say, that the guys that got off the racing line going into the first corner, it ended badly quite a number of times for many different drivers.
Right away. The first one, it was crazy too because I'll jump a little bit, but same thing happened to Vettel when Vettel was one of the first one to put the medium tires on, so the slick compared to the intermediate or the wet. And he just hit a small patch at 360 like it was nothing. But yeah, like Hülkenberg gets on the intermediate, comes out of the pit, and gets off the track right away and loses precious seconds. Still finished 7th, but he could have been a little better maybe in front of his teammates if that didn't happen. Now, the first couple corners were really airy after the safety car went in. And even for a few laps before, just the spray in the back of cars, if you were not first, you couldn't really see anything for half the track.
Oh yeah, especially when they were behind the safety car, and then also after the safety car went in, it was almost very difficult to see. And then, but it did dry out very, very quickly, I thought. And it was really interesting that when those inters really started to kick in, how quickly the times started to tumble. And then again, it was interesting to see the guys that made that switch from the inters onto the full dry tires. And that was even more of a challenge, I guess you could say, because you really had to be even more careful because some of the guys that were getting sideways on the intermediate tires had to be even more careful going into Copse Corner at turn 1 there, because I think we probably saw half the field go off. We saw both Ferraris. We saw Alonso went off there. He went into the gravel trap. We saw Haryanto go off there. There's so many cars, I think I've lost track. I can go back through my notes and try and figure it out. But let's just say that more cars than not went off. Even Verstappen did, because I remember he was about 4 or 5 seconds ahead of Nico Rosberg at one point after he got in front of him, which that was a great overtake that he did to get into P2.
On the outside, anyhow,
Yes, he was ahead of him for, I don't know, quite a long time, and he was about 5 seconds in front, and then maybe even more at that one point. And then all of a sudden I noticed that he had lost about 3 seconds just looking at the lap times, because they'd gone on to the cameras were focusing on some different cars, and then even Verstappen himself went off at turn 1, but he didn't get into the gravel. He stayed on the asphalt just on the outside of the track there. But he was one of the other ones. Vettel had all sorts of problems. And before we talk about the race itself in more detail, let's just focus now on Ferrari. But they came into the weekend with good news that Kimi Räikkönen has been signed for 2017. He's going to come back for another year. But that was about the high point of the whole weekend for them. Vettel was disappointing. He had to change a gearbox, and he was just wallowing around in the middle of the pack. And Räikkönen, he did respectably, I thought. But just in general, it was a very, very disappointing weekend for them. Räikkönen finished in 5th position, and Vettel all the way down in 9th.
Yeah, it wasn't a good race for Vettel. I mentioned earlier his spin when he was on the medium tires. I think he was the first one to do so. And on the main straightaway, went a little bit off the line because it was a little too quicker. And, well, he did a 360, lucky not to damage the car, was able to put the car back on the track and continue. But he lost precious time, and he lost the time that he was gaining from the car in front of him because of that spin. But he was 5 seconds faster a lap when that happened from the difference between intermediate and the medium tires. So that was interesting in a way, but he couldn't keep the car on the track when it matters. And at the end of the day, finished 9, and Kimi Räikkönen again in front of Vettel. It's been a couple of races now that this has been the case, and I have to say, yes, sometimes it's mechanical misfortune for Vettel or bad luck, but in this sport, you kind of make your bad luck if you're at the wrong place at the wrong time or the small little mistake. And I have to say, I'm quite disappointed with Vettel over the last maybe month and a half. Small driver mistakes that leads to quite unfortunate result for him that are not characteristic of him.
But it's funny that you should say that you make your own luck, and I thought it was quite a potentially I don't know. I don't want to say dangerous situation, but definitely a situation that I really made me sit up and watch was towards the latter part of the race when Vettel was behind Danny Kvyat in the Toro Rosso. He was behind him for a couple of laps and then eventually made a DRS overtake at the end of Hanger Straight. And Kvyat put a bit of a squeeze on him going into Stowe Corner. And I don't think that they actually touched, but they came very close to it.
He almost lost it, but he kept it on the track and he avoided the collision. Yeah, no. And Kvyat, you mentioned top 10 for Kvyat, not bad in the Toro Rosso. Maybe his first positive day in 3 months?
Something like that. I think ever since he was demoted from Red Bull down to Toro Rosso, I think that he's definitely been struggling. I mean, it's obviously when you have the full Toro Rosso team and the B team, if you want to call it that, in Toro Rosso compared to the Red Bull, I should say, that of course there's going to be a difference in performance. I mean, the Toro Rosso's running a 2015 spec Ferrari engine, and the Red Bull has the Renault branded or the Tag Heuer branded Renault engine, and they've been quite a pleasant surprise. They've definitely, I think, overtaken and established themselves as the number 2 team behind Mercedes after Ferrari just have failed to really seize and build on any early season momentum that they had after Australia and Bahrain and China, maybe to a certain degree. And they've really dropped off from there. And I know that they're working hard towards 2017. They're still trying to get more out of the car for this year. Interestingly enough, I was reading just last week that apparently they've already started a group to start working on the 2018 car, which is fascinating to think that we're only halfway through 2016. Right. Obviously, all the teams will be working on next year's cars, but Ferrari actually has a very small but dedicated team to 2018, which just absolutely fascinates me.
Well, you have to take your gain where you can, and if you're the first one to start working on a car, you got a little advantage there. It doesn't matter if it's 4 or 3 years on the road. That's one way to look at it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I always think about when you have like these technical developments and innovations, just how Braun Grand Prix came onto the scene in, 2009? And
out of nowhere
had
to champion.
That double floor or whatever it was, and they completely caught everybody by surprise with this innovation that they had. And it wasn't against the rules. It was more, I think, a loophole in their interpretation of the rules, and they used it to their advantage. And it took the rest of the grid at least half a year to catch up with them speed-wise, which was very impressive. So who knows if Ferrari are looking to find, well, I mean, they're obviously looking to find some advantage for 2017 and 2018, but that just impresses me. But a team with all the literally unlimited resources like Ferrari can afford to do that. And then you have some of the other teams like your Manners and your Saubers that really sort of just struggle to get to race to race. Yeah, exactly.
Especially on Sauber. Well, Sauber is the only team not taking part of the test next week in Silverstone for the new tires and the new specs for next year. You mentioned Red Bull and how they're the number 2 teams in the constructors' power rankings, you could say right now. Because, yes, Ferrari is still second because of those podium from earlier on from Vettel and Raikkonen. But with Max Verstappen's performance now, his 3rd podium, 2nd in a row, overtaken his dad, by the way. Jos had 2 podiums his entire career. Max Verstappen has already 3 in his first year in an actual good car. So, congratulations to Max. He's continually impressing everybody. And I think that Red Bull has found the driver of the future, and it's quite unfortunate, but the spotlight doesn't shine quite as hot on Danny Ricciardo anymore because he's got a little young gun that's quite impressive.
Definitely, and I've been talking to some family and friends in Holland, and it's obviously Max is a huge personality and a huge figure and a very popular guy in Holland at the moment. He has been for a while. But ever since getting promoted into Danny Kvyat's car and obviously winning the Spanish Grand Prix a month or 2 ago has really propelled him to new heights. And I think, at least in their eyes, and I think a lot of people that follow Formula One, that Max is maybe not on paper the number 1 driver at Red Bull, but definitely looking at the results over the last 2 months, he's the number 1 driver on the track. That he's got the same equipment in theory as Danny Ricciardo, but he's just beating him when it comes to the green lights on Sundays. He's just getting it done. And again, he was voted the driver of the day. That's 3 out of the last 4 races. The only other driver was Sergio Perez a couple of weeks ago.
That's the thing, Mark. He tries to do stuff. He overtook Rosberg in a more powerful car on the outside at Beckett Corner. You try stuff and it works sometimes. That's what's impressive with Max Verstappen. And it's quite fortunate that he started winning and finishing on a podium now. Because if it happened last year, he would not have been able to drink the champagne. Now he can actually put that juice on his lips.
Well, it was such a funny story last year as well. He wasn't even old enough to have his road license till halfway through the season.
But he could have
to drive a car, to go down to the store to go and buy a carton of milk or whatever it is. Well,
but
not that
you're allowed
I think
to
he
drive
does his own groceries.
Exactly. You're allowed to drive a car at 300 kilometers an hour, but you're not allowed to drive one at 20.
I know it seems so ridiculous when you put it in those terms, but Max is really getting it done. And again, like you're saying, that pass on Nico Rosberg at Beckett's in a place that nobody really expects him or anybody else to pass. He's up for those maneuvers, and he's willing to try and do it. Of course, sometimes it doesn't work out. We saw that last year in Monaco when he got a little bit over enthusiastic and then crashed into turn 1. But you're going to have these moments with Verstappen. And again, this year at Monaco, same thing. He got a little bit wide and then hit the Armco barrier, and that knocked him out of the race. But he provides some exciting moments. And the thing is that some of these impressive overtaking maneuvers that he manages to pull off, they're just brilliant. It's not like it's a reckless, just let's try and get up the inside or the outside of the guy in front of me, and let's see if something happens and endangers himself and his car and the other driver. It's not that at all. He looks for gaps on the track. Yep. And he gets in there and he pulls it off. He is a phenomenal talent, and
it's clean,
it is exciting to think where this guy could be in 10 years when he's only going to be 28.
Yeah, and his passings are clear too. Something Nico's not able to do. Max is able to do. Clean overtaking of a car that's maybe even more powerful than you, but taking what you can in your advantage. Now, it's great driving by Max. Chris Horner mentioned to Max on the radio right after the race how they were impressed by his performance. And those are words you never hear on the radio from a boss to a driver. Never. You never hear words like, we are impressed. Those are things that doesn't happen. It's happening.
Definitely. And I think that it was an inspired move by Max, and I'm sure that his dad, Jos, had a lot to say with it, because
Jos was probably surprised because he never achieved a move like this in his career, probably.
Well, exactly. But the thing was, they had the opportunity to go to Mercedes. I believe it was the beginning of last year, but Toto Wolff was only going to offer Verstappen a reserve driver role. So he would have a little bit of luck like a Wehrlein and maybe get loaned out or drive for another team like Manor, like Wehrlein does. But it's kind of interesting. There was a couple of weeks ago, they were doing a photo shoot at Hockenheim, and you see Hamilton, Rosberg, and Wehrlein all dressed up in the Mercedes colors. But only 2 of those 3 guys are driving in the Silver Arrows on Sunday. Anyhow, they turned down that opportunity, that reserve driver role at Mercedes, went to Toro Rosso with the hope that perhaps he could impress there and maybe promote himself into the main team at Red Bull, or maybe get a drive somewhere else. There was some talk before this whole saga with Danny Kvyat, those several races ago, and how he really managed to get himself out of the Red Bull in a real hurry, that his name was at least being mentioned in the conversation that perhaps he could be in that number 2 Ferrari for next year. Obviously, that is a bit of a moot point now with Raikkonen staying, and the fact that Ferrari never really give opportunities to young drivers, especially a driver as young as Max Verstappen. But definitely the move that they made to stay with or go to Toro Rosso has really paid off, because he's definitely quicker than Ricciardo, and it will be fascinating to see where the 2 of them end up at the end of the season.
No, exactly. And Mark, we've been talking about this Grand Prix for 20 minutes, and we still haven't talked about the controversy of this Grand Prix. The guy who finished second didn't actually finish second. He finished third.
Well, that's the thing. And it just goes to tell you like how an exciting and what a fantastic race it was that has taken us this long to get to what is probably the key moment, obviously, other than Lewis Hamilton winning the British Grand Prix.
Can you imagine
and that
if
was
Lewis...
Nico Rosberg getting a 10-second penalty for a breach of the radio rules when he ended up with a box full of neutrals and had a problem with a seventh gear. And you had a little bit of audio to play for that. So why don't we just let everybody listen to what happened through the ears and mind of Nico Rosberg.
Driver default 101, chassis default 01, chassis default 01. Avoid 7th gear, Nico, avoid 7th gear.
Well, what does that mean? I mean, I have to shift through it.
A firm, Nico, you need to shift through it. A firm, you need to shift through it.
So those words at the end, A firm, you need to shift through it. A firm, you need to shift through it. Takes about 4 seconds to mention it, but it cost him 10 at the end of the day.
Yeah, and not only that, it cost him those extra points, which meant that going from second to third on the grid means that instead of being 4 points ahead of his teammate, Lewis Hamilton, there is now only 1 point between the two of them. Nico Rosberg is still in first place with 168. Lewis is now in second with 167, and then somewhere way back in the distance is Kimi Räikkönen with 106. But that was quite surprising because Lewis was firmly in control of the race. I think that he was going as fast as he needed to. They were trading fastest laps back and forth before Rosberg had the gearbox issue. And Rosberg, he was held up for several laps behind Max Verstappen. He didn't really push it or make any risky moves to try and get around him. I'm sure that in the back of his mind was maybe that incident at Montreal and kind of sliding through the chicane just near the wall of champions at the end of the circuit there at the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve. But it was a good pass that he made to get around Verstappen, but at that point Max's tires definitely were going off, which I thought was interesting because Max is supposed to be one of these guys that can preserve the tires. We saw that last week in Austria, how he made those tires last, and ultimately that got him on to second place. But
this time, Mark, had nothing to do with the tires. When the temperatures and when you go on intermediates and it's actually dry, they're gonna disappear like this. So it's nothing on Max there. Just to go back to Nico for a second, Mark, what if Lewis wins the championship by 1 or 2 points? What if? Because those points would have been lost at Silverstone with that communication error penalty. So maybe that penalty will be more important than we believe. And just to mention again, you heard in the audio, the first part of that message when they say, Nico, chassis default 01, chassis default 01, chassis default 01, that was approved by the FIA before they mention it. What wasn't approved, it was their response after Nico talked. Nico can ask whatever he wants to them. They're just not allowed to answer. So when he asked, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? They should have just not said anything and would have been fine. But because they mentioned A1 confirm, this is actually black and white because it's a directive. So it can be argued that it's a coaching aspect, and that's what is not allowed. So technically, that's why this rule exists. And in the word of Chris Horner, the rule might be rubbish. We agree. But it exists now, and it was kind of coaching. And, well, the rules applies for everybody. And if we would have known, would have maybe told something to our driver today, because we had maybe 10 messages that we would have loved to give it to them. But we can't. They did. And they actually got the podium out of it because if they didn't mention that to Nico Rosberg would not have adjusted those 3 dials to chassis default 01. He would have probably had a gearbox explosion or gearbox the break and not even finished the damn race. So that little A1 confirm might seem silly, but if the rules is fair for everybody, you kind of have to be more firm on the consequences, because now people will be like, you know what? Might as well just do it. Worst case scenario, I'm going to get deducted 10 seconds. And what's 10 seconds if we have like 20 seconds ahead of the guy behind us?
Well, that's so true, because if Rosberg doesn't do what he's supposed to do and he ends up having that catastrophic failure and sprays his gearbox all over Hangar Straight or somewhere else around Silverstone, all of a sudden it's not 18 points to 15 points and that he's losing 3 points, just dropping a position. He's losing them all. It's going to be it's not a good situation. Then all of a sudden, instead of being 1 point ahead of his teammate, he's a whole bunch of points behind him, and Lewis is in the lead. But it was interesting to see like that, how that unfolded in real time, how they told him to do that chassis default 0-1, and how they answered him basically right away. And compare that to Lewis Hamilton a couple of weeks ago at the European Grand Prix in Baku, when he had the wrong engine mapping setting and he was asking the questions of the engineers on the pit wall, and he basically got the stony reply, well, Lewis, we can't really tell you that. This time they just told him to do it. And it kind of builds on to what you were just saying about Christian Horner and the whole opinion he has of the radio rules being rubbish. And yeah, faced with taking a 10-second penalty and still getting some points and still getting on the podium is worth it than rather risking destroying the car and the gearbox and not finishing the race. And you could be right. When we come down to the end of the year, we could be talking after the Grand Prix at Abu Dhabi that maybe Lewis Hamilton wins by a couple of points, or maybe it's Nico Rosberg that has a couple of points here or there and manages just to stay ahead of Lewis to get his first drivers' championships. Yeah. These are the moments that could potentially make a big difference at the end of the year. And if it does pay off for Rosberg, then he'll say, yeah, you know what? It was worth it. Yeah, it sucks that I didn't get on the second step of the podium, but I finished the race and it only cost me 3 points in 10 seconds.
Exactly. And you know what's going to be interesting too is the fact that the engine situation for Lewis is not good. He's on his last one. And you have to believe that this one's not going to last until Abu Dhabi. So he's going to have to start a race at least once from the back of the pack. Probably after the break, because they'll decide to, you know what, we'll make tests on the engine. Can it actually go on the next race, or we should just change it? So in his own words, probably after the break. So that means after 3 races from now, the break will 3 weeks will happen, and they might change the engine then if it lasts till then. But he was able to save a little bit. But that's a question, because he will have to take a penalty probably during the rest of the season, which is an opportunity for Rosberg to make some points, while maybe Lewis going to have to work hard to make points during that day. So it will be interesting, because we mentioned this before on the show. If you decide when to change your engine, maybe you decide to do it before a track that you know you're going to be last, but it's easier to overtake, especially with the Mercedes engine compared to all the other ones. So maybe you have that opportunity to decide when you change it before it gives on you, to be able to take advantage of it. Because if you change it, you better get from last to at least in the points in that race. And if you choose which track to do so, you might have a better chance of doing it.
For sure. And if you're Lewis Hamilton and you have that hanging over your head, and you know that is potentially coming at some point, and it has to, just considering we're not even halfway through the schedule yet, that at some point this is going to be a problem for him. So if he can get these results and he knows that the equipment's going for him, he's got to push, because if he tries to preserve the engine or preserve the equipment, then that's not really going to help him either. If he's trying to catch Rosberg, he's got to try and make the most and maximize the results and the points and the victories while he can, because we don't know what it's going to be like a month or 2 months down the road. It's a long season.
Yeah.
And he's got to get all the points that he can.
Speaking of Lewis and Nico and Mercedes and their relationship, you remember last week when I told you that they hated each other? And I got more proof this week. Just how both drivers were talking about each other. A couple times during the week, Lewis was talking about the other driver as him while pointing towards him. It's him, not Nico. That guy, him. There was a spot where they were doing karting on Sky Sports F1 with Simon Lazenby. You had Martin Brundle and Lewis Hamilton having fun doing karting and having an interview. And at the end of the interview, like a small little, nothing about it comment. Like, yeah, we had fun, guys. That was fun. I was happy to do it with you guys. Yeah, the other guy, him, he would not have done this. That little comment just slips. Nobody talked about it. But I think it tells a lot of the story to me this week. It gives like a storyline to what happened between this rivalry. Now it's, look, Lewis on top now. Lewis had got the momentum. Lewis got the mental edge. But Lewis feels like he's the guy of the people. He does this for the right reason. He talks about the fans, talk about all this. And then you have Nico at the end of his interview with Rachel post-race, where he's asked Rachel, so which one, like, dead face, not really happy, not smiley. Which is the camera that works? Which one? And then they tell us this one. So he turns, looks at it, then he puts a smile on. He's like, oh, and I want to thank the British fans. It's true. You truly are the best fans. And thank you very much for being there. All right, it's over. Okay, thank you. And leaves and smiles drops. Doesn't really tell us the same story than Lewis Hamilton doing body surfing for an hour and a half and having the time of his life with the fans, the real people, the people that he grew up with. And it's not the case for Nico.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that, because I know that just even going back a couple of years, I'm thinking specifically when things started to boil up in 2014, it was always my teammate, the other car, and very much like that same sort of thing. So it seems that whenever things get tense, it's not Nico and it's not Lewis when the other guy's talking. It is always that my teammate, the other car sort of thing. But it is true what you say about Lewis. I mean, he comes from a normal family. His dad and his family worked very hard to get him into karting and to go there. So I mean, they worked their way up. So Lewis knows what it's like. And I heard him several times over the weekend talking about the fans coming, and he knows how much it means for them to spend the money to get the pass for the weekend and to come out to the race, and the sacrifice that people make financially to go and watch and support him.
Camping,
and you can tell that it meant a lot to him to win that race. Obviously, these guys, and you know this as well as I do, I mean, we deal mostly with footballers. I mean, that's what we do most of the time when we're not doing this, that these guys that are at the top level are very, very competitive. But Lewis, obviously, in addition to being focused on winning a fourth world champion or winning that next race, whatever that next immediate goal is, he still recognizes and respects his roots, and he still has those connections. And obviously now he's very wealthy and very successful, but I don't think he's ever lost that perspective, that where he came from and what it took to get where he is now.
Yeah, we're not going to hide too. He lives a jet set type of life. He's friends with people at high places. He's a elite, you would say now, but in a way he wants to give back, and his reaction is genuine enthusiasm after winning today. You could tell it was genuine. And that's the word I was looking for the last maybe 30 minutes to describe my feeling compared to those two drivers. But when I look at Nico, like, no offense to the guy, I never met him, probably won't. And if I do, we're probably not going to make a better impression than I have now. To me, it's the genuineness. It's that little aspect. Another little anecdote that maybe people didn't realize. When he came out of the steward's office 30 minutes later, you had Rachel of Sky Sports F1 there waiting for his comments and they're waiting for like 30 minutes. So of course the man's not going to have that camera open for 30 minutes. It was off, and he came out like almost storming out of the office. So trying to get the camera up in time, it wasn't. He didn't wait a second, just went down the ramp, told Rachel, oh, well, I gave my shot. You missed me. Say that you missed me. Have a good day. Bye. And gave that little fake smile that he still gives all the time. Doesn't help. And when you have like the post-race room, you know, when the cool-off room, let's call it that, the cool-off room, when they take off their helmet and they talk, you had Max talking with Lewis, friendly, and talking about like, hey, you overtook him in that roast. Nice, nicely done. And then Max was saying to Lewis, I was catching up to you. And Lewis was like, yeah, that's cute. No, you weren't. But then they were talking about Nico and just saying him and pointing at him, and Nico was aside. Nico wasn't in that conversation, and when he was, he didn't look at Lewis, didn't even came close to touching him. The first communication between the two was on the podium when Nico took the bottle of champagne and literally drenched Lewis like in vindication, like, yeah, here you go, you little, there you go. That was the feeling that I got, that it was more in vindication than in celebration. And then it got a little cooler since then, but it was kind of tense in that room still.
Definitely. And as long as these two are challenging each other on the track for races and for world championships, it's going to be more of the same. I think that perhaps maybe if one gets a little bit further ahead in the title race ahead of the other, maybe that might lessen off to a degree. But I think that when they're locked so tight, and when you looked at Lewis has won 4 out of the last 5 races now, and we saw that what we thought was a pretty healthy gap. I mean, it was, of course, that 43-point gap that Rosberg had built up
Wow.
in the early stages of the race, or sorry, the early stages of the season, has now been eroded down to a single point. As long as it stays tight like that, of course, it's just going to be extremely tense between the two. But
It's
just
crazy, Mark. This season, you had twice a big lead of Nico melting. Then it come back. Then it melted again. It went from like 51 points down to 9. Then it went back to 43. Now it's down to 1. And all that in the span of 2 months. It's crazy when you think about it. Lewis Hamilton won 4 of the last 5 races. Then you had Nico winning the other one. Max won the one before that. So it was, yes, it's a Mercedes domination, but it's a Lewis Hamilton domination. Literally, like one thing that Lewis Hamilton made sure that he mentioned on TV was, Nico never passed me on the track this year. Not even close to it. Never. It was either in the pits or because of a failure on my part. Never did he pass me on the track. And when we were equal, I was always in front. And that mental edge could be quite important because Nico seems to have pressure building.
Definitely. And whenever it seems to come down to a situation on the track between the two, it seems always to come out when that Lewis will come out on top, unless they crash into each other, which in theory should now be put to rest. What with Mercedes coming up with quote unquote new rules of engagement on what they're supposed to do when they're directly racing with one another, which includes financial penalties, which I don't know is going to be how effective to two guys that already have a lot of money.
But if you say like, okay, you crash into each other, you give me $100,000 every time. Doesn't matter if you have money. Still stings.
Exactly, right? But the big thing is that they can actually take one of those guys out of the car now. So you would have to think that if they have the right to do that to drivers that are under contract to them, because it doesn't seem like a normal thing to do if your guys aren't doing what you want them to, that this has to have been approved and rubber stamped at the very highest levels at Mercedes-Benz. So that will be very interesting to see what happens going forward. But whenever you do get these two one-on-one on the track, you can just tell that Hamilton does have that mental edge, knowing that he's as fast as, if not faster than Nico Rosberg. And when it comes down going one-on-one with both of them, that he 9 out of 10 times comes out on top.
Well, literally at least 8 out of 10 if you extrapolate from 4 out of 5. At least.
That's true.
Speaking of fast, Mark, starting next year, the cars will be a lot faster, especially in curbs. And that is the one thing that got me really interested in next year. We have now, and it's been explained on many different places, the specs and the type of looks that the cars will have in 2017. Yeah, the halo is still under questioning, but at least we know what the tires and what the front wings and what the rear wings will look like. So if you can bear with me for a second, Mark, I will paint an audio picture of what the future car, the future is now, so the car of 6 months from now will look like. First of all, it will be wider as a whole. So the imprint on the width of the car will be 2 meters, which is about half a meter longer than it is now altogether. That's the wingspan, if you want to quote, from the end of the tires in. The front wing itself, it's wider. It's 150 millimeters wider. But the most important difference with the front wing is not its width. It's its shape. Instead of just being flat, at the front, it will be the middle part will be more advanced. It will be like a wave. So it'll be like a small angled triangle at the beginning to kind of cut through air. That theoretically should help the cars be closer together and not get all distorted aerodynamically speaking because of the wake of the other car. if there's a little edge in front that splits the air, it should actually give more space for the car to get in, theoretically. So that's the idea with the front wing. The rear wing will be lower, so not as high, so lower but wider. So the space of air that will hit the wing will be lower, so the amount of pressure transferred won't be as high. So the amount of force needed to give more downforce to the car would be less because it's lower. So all the center of gravity of the car will be lower because of this. And that, in theory, should help the handling of the car. To help the handling of the car, as well, the tires. The front tires will go from 245mm to 305. If you're wondering what 305mm looks like, remember when you went to school? Those rulers? That's exactly the size it is. So that's going to be the front tires, will be that size. The back tire now goes from 325mm to 405. And because of those tires and the size of it, it will give more grip mechanically. So not just because of the downforce, but because of the weight of the car, it will be about 20 kilos heavier, because a little bit more because of the tires themselves, and the bigger size of the car brings more weight. So the weight itself plus those big tires will give the cars more grip. So all that together, in comparison, if you look at Silverstone in a corner that you would do at 105 miles per hour, theoretically with this car you could do at 130. So that's literally what the new cars and new spec can bring. Would it help overtaking? We don't know. Would it help cars go faster and be more easier to handle? It will. So that's, in Lehman's terms, what we can expect for the cars for next year.
Yeah, and it's very impressive. I know that reading up on the new regulations and developments for 2017, even earlier this spring, that they were predicting in some computer models that where they were doing some forecasting for speeds at Spain for next year. And they were predicting that in turn 3 that the speeds could be up to 45 or 50 kilometers an hour quicker than they are right now. So just with that extra grip, all that extra downforce, that is a huge increase in those cornering speeds. So that's very impressive to learn. And it's also interesting to hear, as these cars are getting developed, of course, it's all being tightly kept under wraps by all the teams. They don't usually get them out until you see some of the winter testing pictures where they have those interesting zebra stripes on them to keep it
so you can't really
or get the good detail on photography and stuff like that. So
and now, it's crazy, those pictures. It's always matte paint, so you don't get any reflection of gloss, so it's easier to make the outline of the car now. And so I remember back then, that's like 15 years ago, they even had like fake cars that they would put fake stuff on the car to put people off, so to throw people off. So no, it's always an interesting cat and mouse game when they first do the testing at the end of the season.
Yeah, definitely. And what I have heard from some of the different teams, that the cars, the new regulations are going to make for nicer, aesthetically pleasing cars for 2017, which I think a lot of people will be pleased to hear about, because since they made the switch to this new formula a couple of years ago, I know that some of the cars have not been very pleasant to look at. I always thought that Mercedes has designed a nice car. Williams has as well. Also Red Bull. But some of the other cars have just been pretty... well, I won't say that they're pretty, but they've been pretty ugly. That's a bit of a contrasting term, but
it's like, to be quite fair, it's the buttocks of the car that we didn't like, not the front wing, but the rest of it. It came too slim, too narrow at the end. It almost looked like the Batmobile because it came back and almost had like a motor projector at the end. So that's what we didn't like. Next year, with the width of the car change, that won't be as pronounced, and they'll have like a floor. So now where the car like zooms in the back, you will have like a false floor to help pressure. So it will be almost like a wing, but to the level almost touching the racetrack. It will be like right where the car finishes, there's like a platform that continues for the whole width of the car. So it gives more downforce as well. So no, it will be more similar to a car from 2003, 2004, but not as clunky with the same lines as now, but a little wider at the end, if you can understand that picture that I'm trying to paint.
Yeah, and definitely the big improvement, obviously, is the wings, the widths of the tires, because when you're going from, what was it, 245 to 305 on the front tires,
Exactly.
that's a big increase, and on the rear tires too. And I was looking at some pictures of some of the cars back in the 80s, not so long ago, and just they were so wide back then, and the tires the same thing. It really looked like the tires, especially the front tires, seemed to be really sticking out a long way on the front suspension arms. So it'll be cool to see once these new cars get rolled out for 2017. Obviously, there's a lot of racing to be done this year before it's all said and done. But I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what the designers and the engineers can come up with for next year and beyond.
Exactly. And now we're heading to Hungary, to a little bit outside of the city of Budapest, to the Hungaroring for the Hungarian Grand Prix, which is probably going to suit Mercedes, let's face it. And they have new aerodynamic parts that they actually installed for Silverstone, which maybe would make us realize why there's a 1.5 second between them and the rest, well, especially Lewis. But so Hungaroring will be probably a repeat of Silverstone at the result.
And also the Hungaroring is not really a track where there is a lot of overtaking and a lot of passing, so qualifying will be key. Obviously, Rosberg will be trying to outdo Hamilton. Hamilton will be trying to outdo Rosberg, and Max Verstappen will try and pass anyone wherever he can. And sometimes...
You know what? Here's my bold prediction. He will overtake someone in Hungary.
And in a position or in a corner that none of us will probably expect, so
Exactly.
it could be pretty exciting. But yeah, there isn't a lot of places to pass on that track, and it can get pretty dusty when you're offline. So it always makes the start a little bit interesting, especially for the cars that are on the dirty side of the track. And what with the driver aids that have been reduced and taken away over the years, that some of these guys that haven't really nailed the new starting procedure, it could really it could shake things up at the beginning of the race for sure.
The nickname of the Hungaroring is Monaco without the rails.
That seems like a pretty good description of it. But yeah, so that's coming up in a little over a week and a half from now. And we were talking before we actually went on air that I was under the impression just after watching the British Grand Prix last week that Hungary was coming up right away this weekend, and thinking, gosh, I really need a weekend off between races when we have all these other things going on. And luckily for me, I mean, of course, I'm up to watch a Grand Prix every weekend, but with everything else going on, I thought a weekend off would be okay. And of course, it is not for another couple of weeks. So
yeah, I'm not going to lie
good.
to you, Mark. When I woke up today, I'm like, yep, no need to talk about the Euro today. I'm like, yeah, it's kind of a weight off my shoulders. But then I realized, yeah, Rio starts in 3 weeks.
So it's only the calm before the storm.
Exactly.
So. Well, it's always nice to be able to go from one thing to the next. And what with all the work that we do now, there really isn't very much of a quiet downtime during the year. There's little lulls here and there throughout the year, but it never really stops. It just goes from one thing to the next. And that's okay. That's what we do, and that's what we love to do. So yeah, it's part of the fun.
My downtime, I consider daily, like when I sleep. That's my downtime. That's my off season. So otherwise, yeah, it's pretty much game on daily.
Yeah, definitely. So before we wrap it up for this episode, just a couple of things in closing. The radio appeal, or the demotion from second to third with that 10-second penalty for Nico Rosberg. Mercedes had appealed that, or they were considering launching an appeal, but they have since withdrawn it. Obviously, they realized that what we talked about, that instruction to shift through seventh gear, was not going to be overturned. So they've just accepted that. And then the other team news that came out this week is that Sergio Perez and Nico Hülkenberg have been confirmed at Force India for 2017. So slowly the seats around the grid are starting to get taken up and filled up for next year. Obviously, Rosberg is without a deal for 2017, although he's still in talks for a new contract with Mercedes. So unless we hear otherwise, we just have to assume that will get done at some point. So Mercedes looks like they're set. Red Bull is set. Ferrari is set for next year. Force India. I guess the next question is what's
Williams and
happening
McLaren will be the only two maybe potential decent. Maybe.
McLaren and Williams. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe Williams. We'll see because, yes, Bottas will be there. But Felipe Massa might not. And with the potential Petrobras might come out to sponsoring. So without that sponsor, maybe Felipe Massa is not going to stay at Williams. And there was rumors early Sunday morning on the Daily Mirror, so you can take those rumors for what they're worth of maybe Button. But even Button were surprised by those rumors. Button will start talks about contracts with McLaren in September. Those were the words of McLaren to Button. Look, we'll talk about it in September. So they'll see what happens there. But the rumors were maybe Button with Williams, because if you look another season with changes and all that, a veteran presence like a Button that have been to this type of transition like 4 times in his career. He's been driving since 2000. He's been in F1 since 2000. So he has seen the evolution, and maybe his experience can be even more helpful than it is. Or McLaren would maybe like to keep him for the same reason. But we'll see, because actually he wants a car that has maybe a little bit more pace, because he's like, I try to hold on. My goal is to qualify the top 10 and try to hold on for a finish in the top 10, because cars are passing by me in places they're not supposed to. Cars are faster than me. And if it's wet, it's fine. But then we're getting to a straightaway and every car is pulling apart from 2-car length. How do you want me to compete? So he might want a car and want to, in his own words, he says the only thing that he mentioned that could maybe make speculation that he might leave, he said he wants to fight for podium. And right now, the way the Honda engine is performing, to be quite honest, they're far from it in McLaren. So is the opportunity for podium with Williams? That's doubtful. But with Williams, we know all the work they can do in designing a car. We know that whenever F1 changes rules in history in the last 50 years, Williams usually is one of the teams that perform better outside of it, because they can use their ingenuity, and it's not just about money. So when this happens, Williams comes back on top. It happened 2 years ago, it happened 20 years ago, and it happened 40 years ago. Is it going to happen next year? There's a possibility. And if Button can drive for Williams to help that, maybe that's another possibility for Button. And if I'm not mistaken, Button, did he drive for Williams before? Like years ago?
Did he?
With
I'm
BMW
just trying to
Williams
remember,
back then?
because the first time I remember watching Jenson Button race
with
live would have been the 2001 European Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. So that's going back quite a number of years ago now. And Button, he seems like such an old veteran. Of course, he has been. And of course, yes, he did come into Formula One with Williams in 2000.
Yes.
And he drove for Benetton,
For
Renault,
Bar,
Bar, Honda, Braun, and then he's been at McLaren since 2010. So
which basically were like a Bar, Honda, and Braun is the continuity of the same team, which is Mercedes. So basically, Mercedes is Bar. Is that what you're saying? It's true.
Yeah, I guess so.
If you think about it, wow, they have come a long way.
Yeah, well, that's right. No, if you look at the progression, it went from Bar F1 to Honda to Braun, and then Braun was only around for that 1 year, and then
But they
of
won
course
the championship.
morphed into Mercedes. Yeah, absolutely amazing. That was quite the year that they had.
That's the Leicester year of
2000.
F1.
Yeah,
Braun GP was the Leicester City, but of 2009.
very much so. That was an impressive year that they had, definitely, with Jenson Button and who was it? Rubens Barrichello in the second car.
Yeah,
that was
Barrichello.
yeah, very cool, very cool. Well, Kevin, what else do we have, or is that it for this week?
I think it's pretty much it, and it's time for a little weekend off to get ready for Budapest.
Definitely. Okay, well, before we go, why don't you just remind everybody where they can find you online and the Sports Podcasting Network and where we can find all the shows.
Sportspodcastingnetwork.com, and you can find myself on Twitter at Kev Laramee. If you have any questions, emails, anything, sportspodcastingnetwork@gmail.com.
Very good. And of course, if you want to follow the show on Twitter, you can find us at Scuderia F1 Pod on Twitter. My own personal Twitter is at Mark J.R. Dailey, and the last name is Dailey. Well, thank you very much for listening to episode number 13 of Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One racing. That's a wrap for us. We will catch you in 2 weeks after the Hungarian Grand Prix. That's it. We're out.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1pod@gmail.com.
You were listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us, sportspodcastingnetwork.com.